Space is so important to every aspect of our lives, from farming to banking. We use space routinely. People watching this podcast are using space assets. The other challenge that I'm worried about is our workforce. So if we're not the ones investing in that cutting edge science, somebody else is going to do that, and we're not going to have the manpower. We just released an international strategy recently, so working with them to make sure that together we are meeting the technology challenge of the future. The days, I think, or at least I hope they're over, of where Defense Prime A makes a certain receiver and only satellites made by defense contractor A can use that receiver. That has got to change.
Hey, Stacie, thanks a bunch for joining us here on Microjourneys. It's a pleasure to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
Now, your story is rather interesting. You've had quite a bit of influence in a variety of different locations that has led you to your current role here as a Chief Science Officer for Space Force. So kind of starting back at the beginning, you started your educational campaign in Arkansas, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So it was over at Little Rock, right?
Yep. Yeah, I grew up in Little Rock and went to the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, majoring in chemistry.
Okay. Now, did you always have a passion for science and technology, or was this something that happened while you were in school?
No, I've always had a passion for science and technology. I used to drive my family crazy asking questions, and I drove my teachers crazy when they always said I was the most curious student they'd ever had, which I think was not a good thing at the time. But I mean, it was good that I was like that, but it wasn't good for the teachers.
Yeah, well, passion drives a lot of, kind of not only our lives, our careers, but it's exciting because you get to do something that you love and enjoy, right?
Mhm.
So from there, you transitioned over to California.
Yeah.
And now, was that something by choice? Was it aligned with your interest areas? How did California fall into your life?
So I was very interested in going to the University of California primarily when I was looking at all the brochures that they send you for graduate school. I was working in a very male-dominated environment, and I remember in my some of my advanced laboratories, the professor had the women wash the glassware and the men run the instruments, and I had an industrial fellowship where I was in a very male-dominated establishment, and I just really wanted to be around more women. And so one of the things that UC Santa Cruz, they really targeted, um, recruiting women. And so that's the reason that I ended up at UC Santa Cruz. Also, the professor that I got my PhD thesis from studied photochemistry and light matter interactions, which I've been interested in ever since I was a young girl and went to the Natural History Museum and saw the exhibit that had rocks where you could push the button and turn on the UV light and see the phosphorescence. That just really just amazed me. So I've always been interested in how light does things like that.
Which is really interesting because, the interaction that light has on a variety of different materials interfaces not only on our day-to-day, but a variety of other things, everything from the science, technology to the Defense Department. There's just a whole spectrum of items. So you had a passion in this space.
Yes.
And as you had a passion here, you were talking about your PhD and your future advisor, correct?
Yes.
And so describe that tie.
Yeah. So when I looked at the phosphorescence, I was just really curious as to what that was. And what I didn't understand at the time was light interacts with electrons in matter and causes them to emit light in other wavelengths. And so fluorescence is done at the shorter time scale. Phosphorescence takes longer. So for example, Tide puts these phosphorescent material in the laundry detergent so that it kind of glows. And anytime that I don't know if you're old enough to have gone to a Spencer's where they had all the black lights and all the white clothes glowed, and that's because of the laundry detergents putting in the phosphorescent materials. But my thesis advisor was looking at how do biological systems harness light to do specific functions. So, for example, I studied rhodopsin, which is a protein in your eye that's responsible for your ability to see in the light. And so your eye absorbs the light, it initiates this cascade that it eventually ends up being a nerve impulse that is received in your brain. So, studying that, I was just really fascinated to see how light interacts with different types of systems.
That is really interesting. And that now, was this the precursor to you going for your PhD, or was this part of your PhD work?
So, that was my PhD work. But one of the reasons I went to Santa Cruz was because reading about this professor's work, because he looked at a lot of different systems. He looked at rhodopsin, at bacteria rhodopsin, at cytochrome, lots of different proteins. And so I just thought that would be really interesting to learn about that and to understand that.
And so now your journey takes you from California over to New Mexico.
Yes.
And over in New Mexico, you went to Los Alamos, correct?
Yes. I went to Los Alamos because there was a new technique. So I was studying proteins in graduate school, and I was looking at photo initiated, so light initiated reactions of proteins. So you zap them with the light and then see how they change with time. And to do that for a protein's really complicated. And so looking at a single wavelength, which was where the technology was at that time, but to look at the entire spectrum where proteins absorb. And so to do that was not possible at that time and on timescales that were shorter than milliseconds. And so a German professor had developed a technique called step scan infrared spectroscopy, where he was decoupling the time from the spectral components of the technique. And I wanted to build that in the US. And so that's why I went to Los Alamos, was to do that.
Interesting. And I'm assuming that prior to this, a lot of it was direct proton interaction of light, but you're including, and maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but either a tomography or a laminography to see all the different angles of the protein as it interacts with light. Am I capturing this right?
So what I was looking at was absorption
Okay.
spectroscopy of the protein. Um, so proteins absorb in the mostly in the infrared, and the way that we studied proteins at the time was Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. And what that does is you have a moving mirror that gives you all of those wavelengths at the same time. But that mirror, for the mirror to move back and forth enough times to get a good signal, the fastest you could do was on the millisecond time scale. But proteins will start to relax on the picosecond time scale.
Oh,
So
interesting.
being able to shorten that, because mechanically the mirror could not move that fast. So the way step scan worked is you held the mirror in a specific position, you hit the molecule with the laser, the protein did its thing, and you measured how it changed. Then you moved to the next mirror position and did the same thing all over again.
I
So, in order for a system to be able to do that, you either needed to change samples every time, or it needed to be something like bacteria rhodopsin that cycles. So, you hit it with light, it goes through a series of different configurations of the protein, then it goes back to the original state.
That is really, really interesting. And all of this is taking place at Los Alamos. Now, was this your first interaction with a government lab, or was it
Yes,
okay? It sounds like your net takeaway here, given the way that your career trajectory went, you had a good experience, and this was something that you really appreciated.
I did. One of the nice things about Los Alamos was I had pretty incredible colleagues. We also had lots of resources in terms of different types of instrumentation. It was also a very collaborative environment, so we all shared different instrumentation, so you could do, lots of different types of experiments by working with the team, which I really appreciated that. Whereas in my graduate laboratory, which was, a great place, but we really did a certain type of technique. We didn't have access to lots of different types of techniques.
Interesting. So after your PhD over at Lano, where did your career take you after that?
So after that, I went to the Boston University. And I went to Boston University because, as I mentioned, the StepScan FTIR, they were setting up a system there as well. And so I was interested in doing that. But also, when I went to Boston University, my professor was starting a startup biotech company in an incubator space in the Boston University Photonics Center. And so I was very fortunate in not only being able to do research in the physics department, but also being able to be part of that startup, that was pretty exciting. I really actually love the startup environment.
Yeah, I mean, the startup, it's culture. It's so cool because the person that is owning and operating things is the same person that's helping to, wipe down the tables after lunch and, is over there making sure that the fax machine isn't broken. It's a full spectrum of things that everyone gets to do. It's almost like a Swiss Army knife, right?
Right.
Yeah. So speaking of the government labs over at Lanel, you had a lot of interaction at a variety of different government organizations, DARPA being one of them, AFRL being another. Describe what it was like being at DARPA and what you did over there.
So, DARPA is a really wonderful place to work, as pretty much anybody that you talk to will tell you that. And for me, being around so many, really motivated, very fast moving, very smart people, you can't help but learn new things, right? And putting yourself in that environment helps you grow. The other thing I really liked about DARPA was it wasn't just the Air Force or the Space Force, it was all of the military departments. So I did a project with the Navy as my potential end user, also with Special Operations Command. I had a colleague that next door that worked for the Army. So it was nice. I learned so much about all the different missions that I didn't have an appreciation for before I went to DARPA. So that was I definitely appreciated that.
Yeah, it's interesting with the Defense Department. Uh, you have a spectrum of different mission use cases, right?
Mhm.
There's no two single platforms that share the same kind of space. I mean, it's irregular warfare and then there's traditional warfare. And balancing all of that while incorporating a brand new set of technologies like what DARPA does creates an ever-changing environment.
Right.
And like you said, working with the Navy and special operations and hearing about each of their concerns, yet finding, single points that marry up as an area that you can influence is extremely exciting.
Yeah.
So, is there any specific project over at the DARPA side that really resonated with you in something that you said, "You know what? I was either able to make an influence, or I saw this turn into something that was what DARPA hopes for all of its investments, something that stands the test of time, like the internet, which is one of the ones that they like to describe." Is there any project that sticks out like that to you?
So most of my projects were sapped at DARPA, so I can't really talk about those. So one thing that really stuck out with me at DARPA is the working with the operators. So being a DARPA program manager, because you are working to deliver cutting edge technologies, they a lot of doors are open for you. So I got to sit down with a lot of the special operations folks that are actually in the field doing things to talk about what their challenges are. And I was very interested in developing a lightweight laser detection system because being hit with a laser in the eye, that especially if you can't see the laser, can be very debilitating. And so I was very much interested in helping them find solutions for that. I did start some programs related to that, uh, but they um, but they transitioned after I left DARPA.
Yeah, mentioning interfacing with the operator, I think is something that is not well understood in the community. You have a lot of the integrators, the scientists, technologists, et cetera,
Mhm.
that have ideas that are really revolutionary, but how that influences the operator is something that usually there's a gap, right,
Yeah.
between that communication. Having the ability and the opportunity to talk to these operators and hearing about what their mission space is, and then tuning your research or your efforts in science and technology to meet those requirements is just extremely remarkable. Um, with regards to the government labs, you also had a period over at AFRL.
Mhm.
How was that?
I went to AFRL to the Directed Energy Directorate at the site in Maui, which is a telescope site that has several different telescopes with a space domain awareness mission. So using optical telescopes to monitor satellites, and that was my first job with AFRL. And it's probably I always say that all of my jobs were my favorite, but it was really nice. And I also got to work with the operators there. I was developing daylight imaging technology because satellites in LEO to get resolved images of them, so like a snapshot that you can kind of think about, is almost impossible during the day because the sky background is so bright. And also trying to put a telescope in the sun is super dangerous. And so it was a huge challenge. And that was the project that I worked on. And once we had developed that capability, I went to the Joint Space Operations Center in Vandenberg to sit down with the operators to talk with them and, discuss, where that could be applicable because they just weren't used to tasking telescopes during the daytime, optical telescopes, because they did not run in the daytime.
Yeah,
It was
it's a big challenge with daytime telescope observing. Like when people take images of the sun, for example, there's a special filter you have to put on
right.
there. It blacks out all of the sky, but you're looking at something that's an extremely bright target. Now, moving away from that, being able to filter out all of the light and trying to find an image that's in space, that's a pretty daunting task to figure out the science on how to filter out all of the light pollution that would come into the telescope and interfere with what you're actually looking for as the target, right?
Yeah, when I first started, so that project started before I went to Maui, but it but they needed somebody to really focus on it and push it. And so when I first got there and I gave some talks on some of the modeling and simulation that had done, several people came up to me and said, "You need to just give up on that. That is so hard. That is never going to happen. You're wasting your time," which which is not true because we actually did achieve that. And we were able to image satellites even at high noon. But it was I mean, it was not easy. As you said, it was a lot of work and a lot of different people with a lot of different expertise came together to make that happen.
Well, as an amateur astrophotographer, I can tell you that it is extremely hard to take pictures of known objects when it's pitch black outside,
Right.
let alone something that is moving in space with direct light, like you said, at high
Mhm.
noon. I mean, that is just compounding the challenges that
Yeah.
are interfacing with your hardware and the such. Now, was this your first interaction with doing work that influenced or interacted with kind of the space domain?
Yes, it was. That was my very first. I was hired based on my laser and optics experience and program management experience, but then also at the Maui site, the site is on top of Haleakala, which is a dormant volcano, which has a lot of cultural significance for the Hawaiian community. Messaging to the community is really important so that they understood the mission, how important it was, and the fact that the site is respectful of the cultural significance of that. So, my experience working with the STEM, education community, we had a vibrant STEM program as a way to help us not only give back to the community but also connect with the community. So that was why they hired somebody that didn't know anything about space.
And there's such a this is really piquing my interest. At the top of Haleakala, the climate change is pretty dramatic. I mean, from when the sun rises, I mean, it's extremely cold. I mean, not extremely cold, but cold enough to wear a
It is really
jacket.
cool.
And but in the daytime, it gets rather warm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yet another variable that compounds all of the hardware that you're
Right.
trying to tune to go and take these images.
Right. And you have thermal management, you've got light management,
Yeah, and then, things like I'm assuming like dew heaters and the such, and we can go down this path, I mean, for quite some time.
humidity, but
Yeah.
for a big optical telescope too. So yeah, it's very, I mean, it is challenging. As General Raymond said, space is hard.
Yeah. So speaking of space, one of the roles that I met you in was as the chief science officer for Space Force. So one of the new services that has been added to the collection of services here in the United States. Why don't you describe what Space Force is?
Yep. So Space Force was established in 2019. And the reason that it was established is because previously the mission that the Space Force has now, or not quite the mission that we have now, but our space mission was being accomplished by the Air Force Space Command. And but space is so important to every aspect of our lives, from farming to banking. And we use space routinely. People watching this podcast are using space assets. And so space is just really critical. And space was also becoming threatened. So lots of different countries have done anti satellite tests. And so it was becoming more congested and it needed the attention of its own service. And so that's why the Space Force was stood up. And our job is to make sure that we have freedom of action in space in this country. So that is the mission of the Space Force.
Has Space Force found a nice home between all of its other partners in the government? You mentioned SSC over in LA, Space Systems Center, NASA, which is over there on the civil side. You have some of the Department of Defense, or not Department, intelligence community outfits like the NRO, and a variety of other pieces, right, that are all playing in this ecosystem that the United States is investing in space. Has Space Force found a pretty good position not only to interact with these different communities, but also to provide support out to the communities?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the different space functions, a lot of the ones that the Space Force have now were distributed across like the different services, the Navy and the Army, and so that's been lots of those have been migrated to the Space Force. Although some of the services still do have space missions, and then you've got NASA, the civil side of that, which is focused on space exploration. And then the NRO, which is looking at, the intelligence pieces of that. And then Space Systems Command, which is under the Department of the Air Force, which builds up our systems. And so we work across, all of the different agencies. We have a lot of synergies. NASA in particular. So the Space Force has a fairly small science and technology budget for the very low, very immature research. So we leverage a lot from organizations like the National Science Foundation for our basic research mission, and then NASA also that develops a lot of the buys down a lot of the risk for the technologies that we end up leveraging.
Interesting. So with Space Force, they have a collection of leadership roles, and you fall into that leadership as the chief science officer. What is the chief science officer in Space Force? What is your, I guess, roles and responsibilities, and how does that fit into the overall mechanism, which is Space Force?
Yeah, so I am the senior science advisor to the to not the Department of the Air Force, but for the United States Space Force, and so I advise on anything related to science and technology, particular the low TRL science and technology. So I work with the Air Force Office of Science, Air Force Office of scientific research. I work with DARPA. I work with the Office of Naval Research and with the National Science Foundation, communicating a demand signal for the Space Force. I also work with the Air Force Research Laboratory Technical Directorates, like Space Vehicles Directorate, to also provide a demand signal. So that's really part of my job is doing that. Also, I go to a lot of universities. I give talks on what the Space Force does, what our basic research interests are, so that the universities, if they have an interest, can do research to buy down risks for the Space Force. I meet with lots of companies to see what's going on. I always ask them, what are your science and technology hurdles that you need addressed so that I can connect that with what the National Science Foundation is investing in so that I can communicate that to academia. And also, I do a lot of, I think, coalition building and collaborations. I'm a very collaborative person. So I work with, so the Department of the Air Force actually manages the science and technology funding for the Space Force. So I work with those individuals. I also work across agencies to make sure that the funding that we're investing is not duplicative of what other agencies are investing and to leverage that. We also do joint projects together, joint studies. So that's what my role is.
That's a pretty big role,
It
which has
is.
a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah.
And keeping up with, like you said, the low TRLs. One of the challenges that I've experienced in this space is making sure that the investments that the government makes in these areas don't just turn into extended laboratory experiments,
Yep.
that they actually have direction, that influence, not only the organization that's funding, but also the bigger mission, right? And so when I say you have a lot going on there, making sure that everyone is staying in tune with both of those objectives is quite an undertaking.
Yes. No, I would agree with that. And also, keeping the operator in mind for everything that we do, because you bring up a good point. It's really easy for scientists to get caught up in the experiments they're doing and kind of get excited about it because we're all passionate about it. But it's really important to remember that for us in the Space Force, we are doing that to enable the operator to be better prepared. And so I think that that's critical. And one of the things that I spend a lot of my time is with the operators. I think over the last couple of weeks, I've spent 10 days with the operators talking to them about what their day to day challenges are so that I can make sure that our S&T that we're investing in and the S&T that we're leveraging from other organizations is going to go towards, making things more efficient, enabling them to make faster decisions, to manage lots more information.
So with that operator ecosystem, it creates a very interesting, I'd say, set of three pillars, right? You have your launch, you have what actually gets deployed in space, and you have your ground systems, right? How does the Space Force kind of make a spread in influencing each of those three dynamics?
So, well, I guess what do you mean by influencing those? Like, for example, like for launch, we're leveraging a lot of the commercial space sector for launch because, that's an area that's actually grown quite a bit commercially and brought a lot of the launch costs down from where we were before. But I will remind you that a significant amount of federal government funding, particularly from NASA, actually went into building up those companies and lowering the costs.
Yeah, this is right in line with where my question is, and
Okay.
it's a dovetail into what my next question was going
Okay.
to be, which is the influence that the commercial portion of the portfolio within space has. And when I say the portfolio, I'm talking about the United States, Blue Origin, SpaceX, what is it, United Launch Alliance, all of
Mhm.
those players, and there's a variety of others. I don't want to discount some of the hard work that other people are doing, but there's definitely a relationship that is built between the commercial aspect and the government aspect.
Yep.
So that's kind of where my question is coming from. How is that relationship working, and how are you guys seeing a benefit from the Space Force side?
Yeah. So we're in a really different world from an acquisition perspective. Back in you know previously we identified a challenge. I found a technical solution. We funded a defense prime to go and do that. We've got a lot of very complex acquisition laws. We have lots of regulations that we have to fit into, and things took a while to deliver. They were amazing when they were delivered, but they did take a bit of time. Um, Nowadays, like since World War II, we actually have lots of competition from the technology front and lots of competition in space. 20 years ago, we were really the leaders in space with very minimal competition, and now we have more competition, and things are much cheaper. It's a lot more affordable to have assets in space or to rent or buy assets from a commercial provider. And so the Space Force, and we have a commercial space strategy that was published last year that talks about how the Space Force will leverage commercial industry and innovation. And so we see as a balance between leveraging from commercial and also having our own inherent systems that we procure. So a balance between those two where we're minimizing risk. To do that, we have to have a healthy commercial space industrial base. And the S&T community, the investments in the lower TRL is helping to build up that space industrial base. Also, being interoperable, having things that connect across systems is really important. One of the challenges that we have now is, we've been a spacefaring nation, strong spacefaring nation for decades, and much of our infrastructure was built several, maybe a couple of decades ago. So being able to leverage new innovation in a system that was built decades ago is a huge challenge. And so how do we fit that in? So there's lots of things that we're working with commercial development, and that sounded just so terrible. I'm sorry.
No, 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 that's good. Well, and it leads
You
into,
have to edit that.
well, this leads right into the next question I have is, you know, with such a broad spectrum of technology requirements
Mhm.
in order to ensure mission success within the space domain, where do you see the biggest technological risk right now? You have such a variety of backgrounds that you've influenced, right? We were talking about, some of the reflections back with the protein. We were talking about, just a number of different engagements that you have in academia. What technological concerns, challenges, or risks do you see that currently are on your radar as it relates to your role over at a Space Force?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is just a lot of our infrastructure was built decades ago, and it's not doesn't necessarily resonate with a lot of the new innovations. So having that older backbone and trying to automate that and pull in new technologies is a challenge. Now we're working on that, and we've got several programs to help us move faster and help us improve our mission. But that's a challenge. The other challenge that I'm worried about is our workforce. So after before and during World War II, we were it was a horrible time. We were competing against a very advanced technological adversary, and the U.S. put a lot of money into S&T to develop things like radar, to develop things that are critical for national security. And historically, over the decades, we've maintained that investment, realizing that those investments contributed not only to national security but also to economic security. And you can think about the internet, microelectronics, and the computer. Those have really driven our economy, over the last decades, and those were all developed with government funding in the beginning and a collaboration between industry. Um, Academia and the government. Well, now we are really cutting back on what we're investing in S&T, particularly in defense relevant topics. And that really concerns me because that's where our workforce comes from. So if we're not the ones investing in that cutting edge science, somebody else is going to do that. And we're not going to have the manpower to be able to continue on as we have over the last decade. So I see that as a huge challenge in the future.
And it's reflected in the FY26 budget. You see a lot of shrinking of the R&D investment from a government perspective, and a lot more on the production side of things.
Right.
I think it's just a reflection of trying to keep up with the Chinese and how much they're making things. Right, shipbuilding is at an all time
Mhm.
high right now because the Chinese are building just as many ships, but if we don't take care of the future, which is this R&D portfolio, workforce being one of those big ones, we might be able to solve some of the near term challenges, but the scope of the long term challenges gets put into question.
Right. And, industry, a lot of people will say that industry is filling that gap. And industry has really increased their R&D spending over the last few decades. However, they're doing things that are near term, right? Which is what I would do if I was a business as well. They need to turn a profit. What the government has always done is funded those really far term things. And that's what we need to continue to do. So we need to push into that. Now, in my position, I don't control the budgets, but it's my responsibility to make sure that the Space Force has the raw materials in order to be able to succeed in the future. And so I'm working on developing collaborations with other agencies so that we can look at the big picture and see, you know, this agency is going to focus on that while we focus on something different. And also, our international collaborators come into play on this. We just released an international strategy recently, looking at how we are going to partner with our allies. And I see that not only from a operational perspective or a service perspective, but also from a science and technology perspective, because a lot of our allied countries are leaders in many different science and technology fields. So working with them to make sure that together we are meeting the technology challenge of the future, I think is really important.
So we're about to round out the end of this year's fiscal year,
Mhm.
right? What's one of the major items that you've seen in the last fiscal year that Space Force can point to as being a major success, or an area that has really bubbled to the top as something that Space Force is extremely proud of?
Yeah, well, I think that coming up with our international strategy, I think was, I'm very proud of that, because I think it's really important to show that we are going to work together internationally to achieve common goals. So I think that that's very important. From a science and technology perspective, I think that the recent government budget cutbacks, while that, I personally would love to see science and technology have infinite amounts of funding. I will say that anytime that you're put under a stressful situation, your resourcefulness comes out. And so, working across agencies, like we've developed a lot of really strong partnerships with other government funding agencies on the S&T front, to really make sure that we're working together to still meet all of our individual missions.
And I would say that is, I agree with you here, because it's been reflected in not only in our engagements, but engagements that I've seen throughout Space Force. I mean, there's opportunities to co-collaborate with either Global Strike Command or SSC or Missile Defense Agency or NORAD Northcom, as a collective set of solutions, versus just one organization saying, this is the way it is, and this is how we should, get it done.
Mm.
I've seen a lot more of this collaborative nature as of, I'd say, the last 12, 18 months, which has been extremely exciting,
Yeah,
because it's something that the government has long sought after, which is a whole of government solution.
right.
So from a space perspective, you're starting to see that gelling together
Yes.
of thought processes, though they may not be 100% aligned. They're getting close to having some commonality in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So, with that being said, what does the future of Space Force look like? What is on the horizon? You talked about this strategy. I'd love to get your perspective on where you see the direction of Space Force going.
Yeah, I see the direction of Space Force. I think, we've already talked about partnerships. I see partnerships as growing and becoming ever more important. I also see us looking at more proliferated systems, so that we do have redundancies, in the event that something were to happen. Also, interoperability. The days, I think, or at least I hope they're over, of where Defense Prime A makes a certain receiver, and only satellites made by defense contractor A can use that receiver, whereas defense contractor B has a completely different set of systems and they don't intercommunicate. That has got to change, because we just can't continue to operate in these stovepipes, and we really need interoperability. And so that's a big push. Commercial industry is growing. It's a huge growing sector. I see lots of opportunities there, harnessing innovation from different companies, enabling us to move faster, and also having lots of different companies to work with, so that we're not, you know, vulnerable just because we only have one source. So
Yeah, the working faster piece is timely, because the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, just came out with a memo on August 20th about accelerating our acquisition timelines. And you can see that reflected in a number of different congressional acts that are being put forward to help buy down that time from concept to actual executed dollars. So I once again believe that you're spot on here on that being, part of the future. And it takes an ecosystem of players, right?
right.
Not just the services, not just the Defense Department, not just Congress, but everyone co-collaborating, as you had said a second ago, as being the way to help this big machine move forward, which is the United States. Um,
Yeah, and one way too, I think we can do that. When Secretary Hegseth first took his position, he addressed lots of, a group of people in the Pentagon that was then broadcasted throughout the Pentagon. But one of the things that he said that really resonated with me was getting technology out in the field faster, because we spend so much time testing it to make sure that it's really good, whereas a lot of our other nations might be less risk averse and test it pretty quickly. So one of the things that I'm working with is our COCOMs to see if we can have testing in the field done much earlier stage and even potentially ongoing during the development cycle. Because one of the things when I was in Maui, when I first got there, the operators and the R&D people were in two separate silos, and they didn't really interact. And I think I just didn't know better because I started talking to the operators and, going up to the telescope to do the experiments with them. And we were able to move so much faster. And it really gave me an appreciation for what the operational challenges were. And I think if we do that more and more broadly, Maui's a unique place because we had both groups in the same geographical location, but being able to create those opportunities for the S&T developers to go out into the field as soon as possible, I think will really help us move faster.
I couldn't agree more. It's something that a number of different flag officers that I've talked to have said. Look, there's a lot of neat research that's going on and really smart people, but I don't need them to redesign. In the case of the conversations I've had, I don't need them to redesign my cockpit. I just actually need this little lever here to work, and that's what I need. I don't need a Lockheed Martin new system. I
Right.
just need this little tiny thing to work,
Yes.
and it's so common that you'll have these discussions and you'll pinpoint the actual problem, which could save taxpayers millions and millions of dollars on a simple solution versus, like you said, this one off that one organization will make that won't work with the other organization. And now you're paying twice as much to have it either redesigned or retrofitted and the such. So those conversations are so valuable. And I think that if there's a major takeaway that comes from our conversation, it has to be a comfort level that the government gets into in
Mhm.
having those discussions, being open to talking to the users of
Right.
the technology, similar to like you would in many other industries. In the auto industry, you get feedback on why your car is either good or it sucks or something like
Right.
that. So, um, for those that have never worked with Space Force, what advice would you give them on helping the community and the service continue to drive forward with all of the sets of initiatives? If there's a new organization, a new person, what's the best way to engage with Space Force?
So, well, there are a number of ways to engage with Space Force. We've put out a lot of different documents, as I said, on the like commercial industry, on our commercial strategy, the international strategy, to kind of talk about of where we see industry playing a role. We're also working on having a demand signal that goes out to the academic communities to give academics an idea for things that they could work on. For example, satellites are very, very fragile, but lots of the new materials, studying those, like the quantum materials, could potentially help revolutionize satellite building. Become much less fragile. And that's something I see as ripe for the academic community. So communicating those things to them is important. We also have something called the Space Systems Command Front Door, which is a way that industry and academia can go online and register and look at what's of interest to the Space Force. U.S. Space Command actually has a publicly released document that talks about what their challenges are and things that would help make their mission better. We also have something called the TAP Labs. And if I said the acronym, I'm sure I would get it wrong. I think it's the Technical Analysis and Processing Lab, but don't quote me. But we have, for example, a Space Domain Awareness TAP Lab, an SDA TAP Lab, and they run sprints 3 times a year where industry and academia can sign up for these sprints, and the sprint is a operational challenge. You run sort of like a mini war game
Okay.
where you look at these scenarios. This is happening. And then whatever technology that you've developed that you'd like to test, you test in this scenario. So there are data sets where you can pull that in and test your capability and see how it plays.
So this is a tabletop evaluation that would happen.
It's
Uh,
not exactly a tabletop, it's a
okay.
computer screen,
Okay.
because everybody's in their own place. Like people from, in England can participate, or in
Oh,
Australia.
so it's a
It's
remote
all
game.
online, yes.
Okay.
So, but it's really interesting, and I know, and when I was at the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, managing the space domain awareness portfolio, a lot of the professors that I work with, I connected them with this SDA TAP Lab, and they said it was really very helpful in helping them understand whether the direction that they were going in was the right direction for the Space Force, and also having access to real data where you can test algorithms is really difficult. And so you can get access to that. And then we're standing up another TAP lab that's going to be related to human machine teaming, because that's going to be definitely a growth area for the Space Force in the future.
Oh, that's exciting. Yeah, you mentioned a couple of strategic documents. I'm assuming that these are unclassified documents. We'll want to put those in the show notes for those that are listening here today and eager and excited to help Space Force with the overall mission. I think it'll take a village
Yes.
from all different partners to help not only influence their concepts but drive forward this new service, which is the Space Force. I would leave with one other question, and it's more general in nature because I don't want to pinpoint one particular topic. But right now, under the current administration, there's a number of different prioritization items. And for those that track that set of priorities, they can go ahead and look on those. I know you and I want to distance ourselves from specific or talking specifically about one or the other, but from a prioritization perspective, what do you think should either be changed, added, et cetera, to help support Space Force and the mission that you're read into and you see on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think so. I'm getting on my soapbox. Anybody that knows me, I'm on a huge soapbox on our science and technology funding. But science and technology is so critical for all of the military departments, because without science and technology, radar, for example, was just a theory. People thought about it, but the federal government invested funding in it to actually turn it into a capability. And that's important. We already talked about the internet. That was a DARPA program. Um, Microelectronics, all of these things grew out of federal funding. The SpaceX launches, Google came from an NSF grant. And all of that's really important. But and it's actually a really tiny amount of the budget, it's a very small portion. All of the funding that we do for that basic research predominantly goes into academia, educating students like us to then, be, experts in our field. But that funding is always at risk. It's chaotic. I would love to see our country commit to a dedicated percentage of basic research and applied research, the lower TRL funding, to commit to that so that we could consistently invest in these new technologies and continue to be the technology powerhouse we've been for the last century. That's what I would like to see, and not make it a political game. This is something that as Americans, we are committing to that, and that will protect our national security and drive our economy.
So to pull that thread a little bit, do you see this rotational in nature, where there's new solicitations that continue to come out, or do you see this being like a set of newly established centers of excellence that help to focus in on particular science and technology focus areas that others can go and support? How do you see something like that rolling out?
Sure. So what I was just asking for was the very minimal that, so for example, the Army Research Office, the Naval Research Office, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, they have Department of Defense employees that are experts in their field that have typically PhDs that understand the academic community in those specific topics. They have funding. They competitively award that funding to academia that provide grant proposals, and that's they run those portfolios, and that's the money I'm talking about, is making that consistent, where we have a consistent percent. It's still competitive for the academic community because we don't want to just give out money non-competitively, but it would be competitive, but it would just be consistent. So we wouldn't have to worry about, for example, my funding's getting cut 25% this year. So I'm not going to be able to award any grants related to quantum materials, which are critical right now. That's what I'm talking about. Now, the next level, yes, I would love to see these centers of excellence or centers of gravity where you bring together commercial industry, academia, government operators, government acquisition professionals to work together around a specific focus, topic area, as we did, with other topics in the past, like Bell Labs did some incredible things, right? And I would love to see things like that again. But I'm right now asking just for the stable S&T funding so that, it's just such a small amount. And it's just seems like I think I probably, anytime I did any kind of programs in my career, I used to do some STEM projects on the side with very small funding, maybe 25,000 a year. I spent more time having to maintain and keep that funding than I did, say, a much larger program. So I would just like to see us commit to a basic S&T budget that doesn't change regardless of what administration you have.
Well, an interesting data point here is we've seen this through Section 9903B of the CHIPS Initiative, which established the Microelectronics Commons hubs, which is a sustained
Yes.
flat amount of funding that is focused on a particular R&D portion of the portfolio. So it's everything from prototype to pre-production,
Mhm.
and it established these 8 hubs across the United States, all focused in on specific
Right.
technology focus areas. So maybe that could be a data point for 2 fronts. One, that yes, there is a technology sector that has benefited from this, and 2, here are the lessons learned on what worked and what didn't. Because
Mhm.
no program is perfect, but you can always capture those things that are of value and use that as a way to catapult into making a more refined and better program. And who knows, maybe it could turn into something like a neuromorphic center of excellence or some kind of, hypersonic center of excellence. I
Right.
mean, there's a spectrum of different things that it could influence. And I think that that's worth not only bringing awareness to people, but having people talk about it a little bit more to see how to refine a potential, scenario where that is the case, a sustained budget that is in this area, and how to ensure that we as a nation continue to put the smartest people that we have available on these topics to accelerate us so we can have more Googles, so we can have more, ideas like the internet, et cetera, that we can point back to in the next 5, 10 years and say, this is not only the influence we made, but this is the difference we made. And it impacted not only our day-to-day lives, national security, and the world is a better place because of it. So,
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And these hubs, I'm definitely a fan of because I think they prevent stovepipes. So if you've got a hub where you've got academic researchers doing cutting edge stuff, and then you've got commercial industry wanting to develop a product that they then are able to transition into the operational community, removing that valley of death between basic research and actually going to a product, I think is a great use for those hubs. And there's, I'm sure lots of different technologies that we can point to that move faster because of those types of cultivating environments.
thanks a bunch for joining us here on Micro Journeys. Really thankful for you to have the time to sit down and talk about something that is really important here to the nation.
So thank you. I really appreciate it. And thanks for your time and questions and drawing attention to some things I think that are really important. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing the intriguing discussion on Space Force. So stay tuned.
Thank you.